They say love dies when feelings fade, but that's not the real reason men lose the woman they love. The truth is far more uncomfortable. Most men destroy attraction without even realizing it, through neediness, emotional blindness, and silent behaviors women never openly talk about. And by the time he understands what went wrong, she's already emotionally gone. Before you walk away from her, or before she walks away from you, watch this carefully. Because the truth about love isn't what most men were taught, and learning it too late can cost you everything. There's a moment that breaks almost every man emotionally, but very few ever talk about it honestly. It's the moment when the woman he thought would always stay suddenly feels distant. Her texts become colder. Her energy changes. The warmth disappears little by little, and he keeps asking himself the same painful question. What happened? But the terrifying part is this. Most relationships do not collapse in one dramatic moment. They die slowly, silently, and psychologically long before anyone officially leaves. Most men are taught to look at love from the outside. They focus on attraction, attention, loyalty, and physical connection. But very few understand what truly controls human attachment beneath the surface. Because attraction is not just emotional, it's psychological. It lives deep inside subconscious patterns people don't even realize they are following. One of the biggest mistakes men make is believing that love survives purely through effort. So they try harder. They text more. They become more available, more emotional, more sacrificing. But human psychology has a strange relationship with emotional energy. The more someone feels you are emotionally dependent on their presence, the more pressure they subconsciously feel around you. And pressure quietly kills attraction. That doesn't mean women don't want love. It means the human mind naturally values emotional strength more than emotional desperation. A calm presence creates safety. A desperate presence creates emotional weight. And many men don't notice the shift until it's too late. What hurts even more is that women rarely announce when they begin emotionally disconnecting. Most men think the danger starts when she becomes angry, argumentative, or distant. But psychologically, anger still contains emotional investment. Silence is what should scare you. Because when someone stops trying to explain their feelings, it often means they no longer believe being understood will change anything. That's why some breakups shock men completely. He thinks everything was fine because there were no major fights. Meanwhile, her emotional connection had been slowly fading for months. Not because of one giant betrayal, but because of repeated emotional patterns the male mind often ignores. Small moments matter more than people realize. Not feeling heard, feeling emotionally alone beside someone, feeling like affection only appears when things are about to fall apart. Human beings store emotional experiences quietly. The brain records patterns more than promises. And once negative emotional patterns repeat enough times, the subconscious mind begins protecting itself emotionally. This is why many people leave relationships emotionally before they physically leave them. But there's another truth nobody talks about enough. Attraction is deeply connected to emotional contrast. The human brain is not designed to stay emotionally stimulated by predictability forever. People crave emotional movement, growth, mystery, ambition, uncertainty, progression. When life becomes emotionally flat, the subconscious mind starts searching for something that feels alive again. That's why confidence feels attractive. Not because confidence is loud, arrogant, or dominant, but because confidence signals emotional stability and inner direction. A person with purpose creates emotional gravity, and gravity naturally pulls people in. Unfortunately, many men slowly abandon themselves inside relationships. They stop chasing growth. They stop challenging themselves. Their world becomes emotionally centered around one person. At first, it feels like love. But psychologically, losing your identity changes the energy of the relationship completely. Because attraction cannot survive where self-respect disappears. And this is where the deepest mindset shift begins. Real love is not about controlling someone's feelings. It's about understanding human nature deeply enough to stop acting from fear. Fear is what destroys most relationships. Fear of losing someone. Fear of abandonment. Fear of not being enough. Fear causes people to overreact emotionally, seek constant reassurance, become possessive, or lose emotional balance. And ironically, the behaviors created by fear often push people away faster. Emotionally mature people understand something powerful. Love grows best where there is emotional freedom. The strongest relationships are built between two people who choose each other without emotionally imprisoning each other. That kind of connection feels calm, not chaotic. Secure, not controlling. Deep, not desperate. And maybe that's why so many people confuse emotional intensity with real love. Chaos feels addictive because uncertainty activates powerful psychological responses in the brain. The emotional highs and lows create attachment loops that feel passionate. But true emotional connection often feels quieter, safer, more stable. And many people are so used to emotional chaos that peace almost feels unfamiliar. The hardest lesson most men learn too late is that attraction is not maintained through chasing. It's maintained through emotional presence, purpose, self-control, and genuine understanding. The more emotionally centered a man becomes within himself, the less he needs to force connection. People naturally feel safe around grounded energy. And when someone truly values themselves, they stop begging for love that requires them to lose their identity. Because no relationship can heal a person who has abandoned themselves internally. At the end of the day, human beings are not only attracted to beauty, attention, or words. They are deeply influenced by emotional experiences. How someone feels around you shapes everything. Your energy, emotional stability, reactions, mindset, and self-respect silently communicate more than your promises ever will. And sometimes the greatest transformation happens when a person stops asking, "How do I make someone stay?" and starts asking, "Who do I become when nobody is validating me?" Because that question changes everything. And that's where real power begins. There is a specific kind of silence that changes everything in a relationship, and most people don't recognize it when it begins. It doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't announce itself. It comes slowly through distance in tone, delayed replies, and a shift in emotional energy that you can feel but cannot always explain. And by the time most men try to understand it, they are already reacting to an emotional story that was written weeks or even months earlier in her mind. What most people call losing love is rarely about love disappearing instantly. It is usually about perception changing. Because in human psychology, attraction is not a fixed emotion. It is a living response to how someone feels in your presence over time. The mind is constantly collecting emotional evidence, and it quietly builds conclusions long before words are spoken. One of the deepest misunderstandings in relationships is the belief that effort alone maintains attraction. Effort matters, but effort without emotional awareness can create the opposite effect. When a man begins to overextend emotionally out of fear of losing someone, something subtle happens in the subconscious mind of the other person. What once felt like admiration starts feeling like emotional pressure. And pressure, even when it comes from love, changes how attraction is processed internally. Because attraction is not only about what you do, but the emotional weight behind why you do it. Human beings are deeply sensitive to emotional balance. When one person becomes emotionally centered around the other, the dynamic quietly shifts. Not because love is wrong, but because the brain interprets emotional dependency as instability. And instability on a subconscious level reduces desire. Not instantly, but gradually, like a feeling that something essential is no longer the same. This is why many men feel confused when they say, "I did everything for her, but she still changed." The truth is, attraction was not responding to everything. It was responding to the emotional energy behind everything. Another hidden layer in psychology is how people respond to emotional certainty versus emotional growth. The human mind is wired to respond strongly to progression. Growth, ambition, mystery, direction, these things create psychological movement. When a relationship becomes emotionally predictable, even if it is safe, the subconscious mind can start to disengage. Not because safety is bad, but because emotional stimulation is part of how human connection stays alive. This is where many relationships quietly weaken, not through conflict, but through emotional repetition. The same reactions, the same conversations, the same emotional patterns without depth or evolution. The mind starts to feel like it already knows what comes next, and curiosity slowly fades. And once curiosity fades, emotional presence begins to weaken. But perhaps the most overlooked truth is this: people rarely leave suddenly. They leave emotionally first. Long before someone decides to walk away physically, they often begin detaching internally. This detachment is not always conscious. It starts as small emotional withdrawals, less excitement, less engagement, less emotional openness. And most men don't notice because they are still focused on maintaining the relationship externally, not observing the emotional shifts internally. And when communication finally breaks down completely, it feels sudden only to the person who was not paying attention to the gradual emotional distance. There is also a powerful psychological contradiction in human behavior. People want love, but they are not always attracted to emotional overavailability. Constant emotional accessibility can, over time, reduce the sense of emotional value. Not because love should be distant, but because the brain naturally assigns more value to things that feel balanced, stable, and self-contained. A person who has their own emotional center, their own direction, and their own identity creates a different kind of presence. It feels grounded, and grounding creates trust. But emotional instability, especially when it becomes centered around validation, creates unconscious tension. And tension is the silent enemy of attraction. What makes this even more complex is that many people confuse emotional intensity with emotional connection. Intensity can feel like love because it activates strong emotions quickly. But connection is something deeper. It is built through consistency, emotional safety, and mutual psychological understanding over time. Intensity burns fast. Connection builds slowly. And when people mistake intensity for connection, they often chase the wrong kind of emotional experience, thinking it is love when it is actually emotional activation. At the core of it all, human attraction is not just about appearance or words. It is about how someone's presence affects your nervous system. Do you feel calm or anxious? Secure or uncertain? Seen or emotionally alone? These responses happen below conscious thought, and they shape attachment far more than logic ever could. The real shift in understanding comes when a person realizes that love is not something you force into staying. It is something you understand deeply enough not to destroy through unconscious behavior. Emotional awareness, self-regulation, and identity are not just personal strengths, they are relational foundations. Because in the end, people do not stay where they are begged to stay. They stay where they feel emotionally safe, respected, and naturally connected without losing themselves in the process. And sometimes the most powerful realization is this: the goal is not to hold on harder, but to become someone who does not lose themselves while holding on. And that changes everything. There is a moment in almost every relationship where nothing looks wrong on the surface, yet something inside starts to quietly change. The conversations still happen, the messages still come, the presence is still there, but the emotional frequency is no longer the same. And most people don't recognize this shift because they are still focused on what is being said, not on what is being felt underneath the words. Human psychology doesn't change through sudden decisions. It changes through small emotional interpretations that accumulate over time. A person does not wake up one day and decide to detach. Detachment is a slow emotional adaptation. It begins when the mind starts protecting itself from repeated emotional patterns that feel inconsistent, confusing, or unbalanced. One of the deepest truths in attraction psychology is that people don't respond to love the way they respond to emotional experience. Love as a concept is stable, but human perception is not. What someone feels about you is shaped more by emotional repetition than by intention. And when emotional repetition becomes predictable in a way that feels heavy or unchallenging, the subconscious mind starts adjusting its level of engagement without permission. This is where most misunderstandings begin. One person is still emotionally invested, still trying, still thinking everything is normal, while the other person is slowly shifting into observation mode, no longer reacting the same way, no longer emotionally leaning in with the same intensity. Not because they stopped caring instantly, but because their minds started processing emotional patterns differently. Attraction is deeply tied to emotional movement. The brain is not designed to remain equally stimulated by the same emotional inputs forever. There is a natural psychological need for progression, curiosity, and emotional contrast. When those elements fade, even in a stable relationship, the subconscious mind begins searching for something that feels more mentally engaging. Not always another person, but another emotional experience. This is why emotional unpredictability plays such a powerful role in human connection. Not chaos, but subtle unpredictability. The feeling that someone is emotionally present, but not emotionally dependent. Available, but not overwhelmed. Connected, but not consumed. The human mind responds strongly to this balance because it signals both safety and individuality at the same time. But when emotional energy becomes too centered on one side, something changes internally. The relationship stops feeling like a shared space and starts feeling like an emotional responsibility. And even if love is still there, responsibility without emotional relief creates psychological pressure. And pressure slowly transforms attraction into distance. Many men misinterpret this stage completely. They think increasing attention will restore connection. So they try harder, communicate more, explain more, give more. But attraction is not rebuilt through volume of effort. It is rebuilt through emotional recalibration. Because what the subconscious mind is reacting to is not lack of effort, but lack of emotional balance. Another hidden layer in psychology is how people test emotional security without realizing it. These tests are not always conscious manipulation. They are often subconscious checks for emotional stability. Small changes in tone, distance, or responsiveness are not random. They are the mind's way of observing how the other person reacts under emotional variation. and the reaction matters more than the situation itself. If the reaction is anxious, reactive, or overly dependent, it reinforces emotional uncertainty. But if the reaction is calm, grounded, and self-contained, it signals emotional safety. And emotional safety is one of the strongest foundations of long-term attraction. Not excitement alone, but safety combined with emotional strength. What most people never realize is that attraction is constantly being updated in real time inside the subconscious mind. There is no single moment where someone decides everything. Instead, the brain keeps asking silent questions. Does this feel stable? Does this feel exciting? Does this feel emotionally balanced? Does this feel like growth or repetition? And depending on the answers, emotional investment either increases or slowly decreases. One of the most powerful but uncomfortable truths is that presence alone is not enough to maintain attraction. Being physically there does not guarantee emotional connection. Emotional connection depends on how alive the interaction feels inside the mind of the other person. If interactions begin to feel predictable, emotionally heavy, or one-sided, the subconscious starts reducing emotional intensity automatically as a form of self-protection. This is not cruelty. It is psychology. The human brain is designed to avoid emotional discomfort. And when emotional experiences feel consistently unbalanced, the mind adapts by lowering sensitivity. That lowering of sensitivity is what people later describe as losing feelings, even though what actually changed was emotional responsiveness, not instant disappearance of care. But there is another side to this truth that is often ignored. People are not only drawn to stability, they are also drawn to personal identity. When someone maintains their own emotional world, their own direction, and their own sense of self, they create psychological depth. And depth creates attraction because it signals that the person is not emotionally dependent on external validation. Dependency weakens attraction, identity strengthens it, and this is where the mindset shift becomes essential. Relationships do not survive through emotional chasing or fear-based behavior. They survive through emotional awareness, balance, and self-regulation. The more a person understands their own emotional patterns, the less likely they are to unconsciously destroy attraction through fear-driven actions. Because fear changes energy, and energy is what people feel before they understand anything logically. At the deepest level, human attraction is not about control, performance, or perfection. It is about emotional experience. How someone feels in your presence determines everything that follows. And when that feeling shifts, the mind adjusts accordingly, often before any conversation about it ever happens. And sometimes the most powerful realization is not how to hold someone closer, but how to become emotionally aligned enough that nothing inside you needs to chase what is already meant to stay. Because what is real does not require force. There is a type of emotional confusion that doesn't come from arguments or betrayal, but from something much quieter, when everything still looks fine, yet one person starts feeling emotionally alone inside the relationship. And this is where most people get lost, because they are looking for problems on the surface, while the real shift is happening in the subconscious mind long before anything becomes visible. Human psychology doesn't break relationships suddenly. It records experiences like data. Every ignored feeling, every moment of not being understood, every time emotions were minimized or brushed aside, it all gets stored quietly. And over time, this emotional accumulation starts forming an internal conclusion that no one speaks out loud, but the mind already believes. That's why attraction rarely disappears in one dramatic moment. It fades through repetition. Not repetition of actions, but repetition of emotional outcomes. When someone repeatedly feels unseen, unheard, or emotionally unsupported, the brain slowly begins to detach its emotional investment as a form of self-protection. And this is the part most men misunderstand completely. They assume love is measured by big moments, gifts, sacrifices, efforts, promises. But the subconscious mind doesn't evaluate relationships in big gestures. It evaluates emotional consistency. How you make someone feel in ordinary moments matters more than anything extraordinary you do occasionally. Because extraordinary moments create memories, but ordinary moments create identity. Attraction is deeply tied to emotional identity. The way a person begins to feel about you is shaped by repeated emotional patterns, not isolated events. If those patterns feel safe, engaging, and emotionally balanced, the connection strengthens. But if those patterns feel inconsistent, emotionally heavy, or mentally exhausting, the subconscious begins adjusting distance without conscious permission. And this is why relationships often collapse without a clear reason that makes sense to both sides. One person feels like nothing major happened. The other feels like something has been changing for a long time. Both are telling the truth from their perspective, but they are not seeing the same timeline. One of the most overlooked psychological realities is that people don't leave because of what you did once. They leave because of how they felt repeatedly over time. Emotional neglect is not always about absence. Sometimes it happens while physically present. A person can be sitting right next to you and still feel emotionally unsupported. And that feeling, when repeated, creates a quiet internal distance that no conversation can immediately reverse, because the mind doesn't wait for permission to protect itself. Another deep layer of attraction psychology is emotional predictability. The human brain is naturally drawn to emotional rhythm, but not emotional flatness. When interactions become too predictable, same responses, same emotional reactions, same energy, the subconscious starts losing engagement. Not because the person is bad, but because the experience stops activating emotional curiosity. Curiosity is a hidden driver of connection. Without curiosity, emotional presence weakens. And once presence weakens, attachment begins to feel lighter, even if nothing wrong is happening externally. This is where many people unknowingly make things worse. When they sense distance, they try to fix it by increasing intensity, more attention, more explanations, more emotional effort. But psychology doesn't always respond positively to increased intensity. If the root issue is emotional imbalance or fatigue, more intensity can actually increase pressure instead of restoring attraction. Because what the mind often needs in that moment is not more force, but emotional relief. Relief comes from balance, not escalation. And there's another truth most people avoid. Emotional memory is stronger than verbal reassurance. You can tell someone everything is fine, but if their emotional memory is filled with feeling alone in important moments, their subconscious will trust the memory more than the words. This is why rebuilding attraction is not about convincing someone. It's about changing emotional experience over time. But perhaps the most powerful psychological shift is understanding that attraction is not something you keep through control. It is something that naturally exists when emotional conditions are right. When someone feels emotionally safe, mentally stimulated, and personally respected, connection grows without force. However, when emotional conditions become unstable, the mind slowly withdraws, not as punishment, but as protection. And protection always feels like distance to the other person. What makes this even more complex is that people often don't realize they are part of the emotional imbalance they experience. Small behaviors like reacting from fear, seeking constant reassurance, or emotionally overinvesting too quickly can change the entire dynamic of how attraction is perceived. Because human beings don't respond to effort alone. They respond to emotional energy behind the effort. A calm presence communicates safety. A fearful presence communicates instability. And attraction is far more sensitive to emotional stability than most people realize. At a deeper level, relationships are not just emotional bonds, they are psychological systems. Every interaction either reinforces trust or slowly reduces it. And trust is not only about honesty, it is about emotional reliability. The feeling that someone remains emotionally consistent even during difficult moments. When that consistency breaks, even slightly, the subconscious begins recalibrating its emotional investment. And this recalibration is rarely communicated directly. It happens silently, internally, and gradually. That's why some people only realize the damage when the emotional connection is already far weaker than they thought. Because by the time visible distance appears, the invisible emotional shift has already been happening for a long time. The real mindset shift is this: relationships are not maintained by trying harder in moments of fear. They are sustained by understanding emotional psychology deeply enough to avoid the patterns that slowly weaken connection in the first place. Because love doesn't disappear suddenly, it loses oxygen quietly. And once you understand that, you stop chasing symptoms and start understanding the system. And everything changes from there. There is a point in almost every emotional relationship where effort no longer feels like effort to the other person. It starts feeling like expectation. And once that shift happens, everything begins to change quietly, even if both people are still acting like nothing is wrong on the surface. This is one of the most misunderstood dynamics in human psychology: the difference between being valued for your presence and being expected for your availability. Most men never notice when they cross that line. Because it doesn't happen through one decision. It happens through repetition, constant availability, constant emotional access, constant reassurance. These things feel like love in the beginning. But the subconscious mind doesn't interpret emotional patterns the way conscious intentions do. It responds to balance, not intensity. And when emotional balance is lost, attraction doesn't collapse instantly. It slowly repositions itself. One of the deepest psychological truths is that human beings adapt quickly to emotional consistency. If someone always responds, always shows up, always prioritizes, the brain stops treating that behavior as special. Not because it loses respect, but because it recalibrates expectation. And once something becomes expected, its emotional value naturally decreases in perception. This is where many relationships silently start to weaken. Not because love disappears, but because emotional contrast disappears. The human mind is wired to respond to contrast more than consistency alone. Emotional highs and lows create awareness. But when everything becomes emotionally predictable, the mind stops registering emotional significance with the same intensity. And slowly, without realizing it, one person becomes emotionally central while the other becomes emotionally reactive to that center. That imbalance changes everything. Because attraction is not built on one person constantly giving and the other constantly receiving. It is built on emotional exchange that feels balanced, dynamic, and mentally engaging. But when emotional effort is always one-sided, something subtle happens inside the subconscious mind of the receiving person. They stop valuing the emotional energy as something rare. Instead, it becomes part of the background. And when emotional presence becomes background noise, it no longer triggers the same psychological response it once did. This is where many men make a critical mistake. They respond to emotional distance by increasing effort. More attention, more messages, more explanation, more emotional investment. But psychology doesn't always respond positively to increased supply when emotional demand is already saturated. Instead of restoring attraction, it can unintentionally increase emotional pressure.